Following my discussion about metaphor in the last episode, I've come to the Nietzsche archive on Humboldtstrasse. Nobody was more interested in the idea of metaphor than Nietzsche. He argued that all knowledge and all human cognition are metaphorical. Illusion is an essential foundation not only of linguistic meaning, but all cognition. He argued for an epistemology whereby perception itself is metaphorical. The mind is a blank slate, or let it sink in slowly, or I lost my mind, or the secrets of the heart are all obviously metaphorical. Here are a couple more phrases that I like. Listening to the Iphigenia Inquiry is a brain cell workout, or he's got a musical brain, or even better, he's brain dead. I know nothing and have a brain of feathers, but I'm hungry for knowledge, which will give wings to the mind. Gary Hagberg bears me out. He said, metaphor, for Nietzsche, anything but a rhetorical device for the generation of writerly colour, is the essential foundation not only of linguistic meaning, but indeed of all cognition. Absolutely. Nietzsche wouldn't have wanted to cloud the issue with false knowledge and cause anybody to lose their mind. He wouldn't have wanted to drench any desert of ignorance with rivers of heart, mind and soul, rather than characterise truth as a mobile militia of metaphors which, after a long encampment in the language of a people, seem as solid as rock, undisputed and obligatory, or to suggest that, in actuality, fixed truth is nothing more than dead metaphor disguised as literal fact, and that only art and the aesthetic could reawaken a sense of insight able to see through the facade. Having grown up in Naumburg, about 50 kilometres from Weimar, and then spent time near Leipzig studying philology, Nietzsche spent many of his years fleeing his home region, and particularly his mother and sister therein. He lived and worked in Basel in Switzerland and on the Mediterranean coast near Genoa. But he frequently returned to Prussia and the neighbouring Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach region. Indeed, it was after he'd spent a difficult summer with Lou Andreas Salome in a small village north of Vienna in 1882 and suffered a denial of his proposal of marriage, and also argued with his mother and sister again, and thereafter fled back to Italy, that he wrote the first sections of a work I'd like to look at later, Thus Spake Zarathustra. After he suffered a mental collapse following many years of ill health and was no longer able to look after himself, then at last his sister Elizabeth brought him to Weimar in 1897. So, is it true that Nietzsche is of the Weimar tradition? Berrios and Ridley suggested that Nietzsche is unique among philosophers in the fundamental role he assigns to the aesthetic, which would have made him of appeal to Schiller. Walker described Nietzsche as the greatest German philosopher and cultural critic of late 19th century Germany, whose thought gives to the aesthetic a cultural and cognitive primacy it had not enjoyed since the age of German idealism, which might have made him of interest to Goethe as a potential employee. But no doubt the great man himself would have said that truth is a music of lies anyhow. Employing reason to interpret metaphor as truth is certainly delusional, but even art and aesthetics cannot reveal truth given that their expression is compromised by the projection of the psychological drive of the subject onto a supposedly objective world of expression. All critical knowledge is subject to the illusion of language in a similar way. Indeed, Nietzsche stated that his dialectic writings are not themselves to be considered a vehicle for truth. His work is presented as an ironic mode of discourse, devoid of rational power, and instead characterised by a pragmatic power play of illusion and rhetoric heaped one upon the other. In his early work, The Birth of Tragedy, written in 1872, he argued that it's only as aesthetic phenomena that the world and existence in general are eternally justified. Thus, as in the Hegel, and as in the list I looked at in the last episode, the aesthetic is separated from the metaphysical and the epistemological. Now the cymbal's brazen clamours ringing boldly in our ears, as Dionysus from his mysteries is unveiled and is revealed, here with his goatfoot satyrs, whirling goatfoot satyresses, and Silenus's unruly long-eared ass that brays amongst them. As regards the metaphysical, the Dionysian, derived from Kant's unknowable noumenal realm by way of Schopenhauerian will, is obscure primeval unity. It's dark and primitive, menacing and intimidating, while simultaneously the Apollonian, derived from Kant's phenomenal realm by way of Schopenhauer's representation of will, is inauthentic, synthetic, counterfeit, bogus, mere appearance. This is the illusion. But as regards the epistemological, the Dionysian is revealed as intoxicated truth, hideous and repulsive, and best avoided if it's not to lead to total annihilation of knowledge itself, while simultaneously the Apollonian is a trance-like glimpse upon those illusions, a naive grasp of superficiality. But then there's the ascetic, triumphant and exultant. At least there's something to be optimistic about. Here, the Dionysian is a realm of sublimity and the ecstasy of celestial rapture. Here, the Apollonian is a realm of beauty, of intelligibility, and of meaning and purpose. Having said all of that, Alex Neil wrote that Nietzsche believed, at least at the time that he wrote The Birth of Tragedy, that the only arts capable of rediscovering the spirit of tragedy was the music drama of Richard Wagner. This is Nietzsche's study, with all kinds of mementos to the great man's achievement, not least early editions of his writing. It's here that we can read that the greatest expression of the glorious ascetic is to be found in tragedy, liberated of self-destructive irony, where the Dionysian and Apollonian cross-fertilise and create a unity of expression. It's here that the metaphysical horror of existence is exposed and made bearable. Here that the ravages of epistemological intoxication are reined in by magical dreams, and the sublime shines through the deceptive veil of appearances. Tragedy, such as that revealed in Iphigenia in Weimar, a thing of fear and pity, dread and hope, brings us face to face with a natural world that maims and kills, that grants life and then removes it. Tragedy imitates those natural forces while always remaining a fiction. It views the sorrow, the terror, the ceaseless disquiet from a distance. Tragedy thus confronts the narratives of human suffering. It's an interrogation and provocation of the contingent nature of the world and its seemingly random acts of violence against humanity. Aristotle wrote of tragedy invoking catharsis, a contrivance of emotional purgatory and release, of spiritual purification. Hegel in turn wrote of tragedy, derived of aesthetic thought and dialectic sublating conceptual thought, as sharing the same ultimate objectives, grasping and expressing the necessity of reality, which he defined as the absolute. Schopenhauer wrote of using tragedy to recognise the terrible truth of senseless striving, and thereafter Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy not as tragedy in and of itself, but as meta-tragedy, the tragedy of tragedy. For always the tragedy is triumphant. It's the glorious aesthetic because it harnesses and reins in the contingent. The tiger is caged. The audience, the reader, the listener confronts the beast as if naked in their total vulnerability. Yet the feebleness and helplessness are surpassed. Mortality is transcended. The tragedy itself becomes eternal, emancipated of the contingent, a necessary being. In later work, Nietzsche moved further towards a non-metaphysical realm. He dropped the Apollonian-Dionysian duality, completely refuting the Kantian and Schopenhauerian distinction between appearance and reality. He refuted both the physical realm of body and the idealist realm of mind altogether. Distinctions are to be found in the empirical world only as expressions of falsehood and truth.
"What is happening to me?" thought Zarathustra, in his astonished heart, and slowly lowered himself onto the great stone that lay beside the exit of his cave. But as he was clutching about, above and underneath himself, warding off the tender birds, behold, then something even stranger occurred. For in doing so, he clutched unawares a thick, warm mane of hair. At the same time, however, a roar rang out in front of him, the gentle, protracted roar of a lion. "The sign has come," said Zarathustra, and his heart was transformed. And in truth, when it grew clear before him, there lay at his feet a sallow, powerful animal that lovingly pressed its head against his knee and would not leave him, behaving like a dog that has found his old master again. The doves, however, were no less eager than the lion with their love, and every time a dove glided across the lion's nose, the lion shook its head and wondered and laughed.
John Walker said that in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche contends that reality of being cannot be grasped as truth, but only as the expression of a will to power. For Nietzsche, as for Schopenhauer, there's an unbridgeable difference between the world as will and the world as representation. There's no conceptual link between the governance of experience and modes of representation. The subject can be conscious of the world as will in an aesthetic sense. Nietzsche agreed with the Aristotelian tradition that existence cannot be given eternal justification by aesthetics, which Schiller might have argued too. But at least art makes existence more bearable. Art helps us to live with the music of lies.
For art encompasses all expressions of culture. It encompasses all explanatory and transformative activity. Art governs the psychology of culture and the individuals therein. Art reveals the values inherent in culture necessarily. Art reveals the values of health versus sickness, of strength versus weakness, of life affirmation and ascension versus life annihilation and decline, and of abundance versus deprivation. Art is discovered by the artist by way of innate predispositions, which point towards life affirmation. Art is not constrained by the conventions of practicalities, as is morality. It spurns the predictable. It requires the incredible. It's inhibited only by the bounds of the imagination. Yet it reveals whether any particular morality favours life affirmation or life annihilation. A noble morality embraces inspirational practices and is grounded in an exultant yes proclaimed to the self, while a slave morality is grounded in a self-defeating no, asserted as an autonomous act of life annihilation.
Nietzsche said the subjective will unites itself to the world not by denying but affirming itself. The source of reconciliation is not insight into a real world of essences beyond the world of appearances, but affirmation of the world as appearance in the mode of aesthetic illusion. The world of appearances is the only world there is. Truth exists only as a perspective. This is why aesthetics can neither represent nor disclose truth, but it can change experience from life-destroying to life-enhancing illusion. To illustrate the modes of life affirmation and life annihilation, Nietzsche looked again to the nature of human suffering. He argued that it's the senselessness of suffering that arouses the greatest indignation among human sensitivities, rather than the suffering itself. We see a person in pain and we empathise. We feel that pain, but more than that, we're exasperated that the human condition is such that people should have to experience suffering at all. Nietzsche argued that this experience of the senselessness of suffering is derived from an impulse to self-annihilation, a confrontation against the very spirit of existence. Instead, the interpretation of suffering, even if the interpretation is essentially a lie, given everything we think is a lie, must be life-affirming. Nietzsche illustrated his point by examining traditional Christian dogma about suffering. He said the Christian tradition has sought to make suffering endurable by hypothesizing a metaphysical kingdom of God that accommodates eternal souls and thereby compensation for suffering. It's pure escapism. It locates the value of suffering in a place that excludes the temporal world and that consequently excludes life itself. He said that looking for meaning beyond the world represents a denial of self. It's life annihilation. Nietzsche also examined a counterexample, the Latin, or what he took to be a pre-Christian pagan approach to suffering. Nietzsche said that the pagan was able to conquer the fear of suffering by emulating the source of suffering. By way of ritual and ceremony, the conqueror assumed the role of inflicting suffering upon others. That's to say, rather than ruminating exclusively on identification with the sufferer, to the exclusion of all else, he or she became the actor in a kind of spectator sport. She became one among the capricious deities. She was the governor of nature, the regulator of human fate, the compassionate one, but also the barbarian, the inflictor of gratuitous violence. For after all, the gods could conceive of no greater gift to acknowledge their supremacy than the exercise of power and brutality. Nietzsche argued that while the Christian concept of suffering involves a reduction that removes life of any intrinsic value, the pagan approach to suffering celebrates the dance of life and thereby enables life affirmation. It's a noble approach to living that transforms the world until it reflects the innate power dormant in every individual, a power that could be unlocked by way of art. The noble is able to reach for perfection by way of unleashing his or her artistic instinct. The noble is not the Agamemnon or the Abraham who wallows in angst at the knife in his hand. He's the hero who honours and celebrates the blade and what it represents. The noble is master, including master of time. He controls the present, the future and the past. He controls the counterfactual, the eternal recurrence. He appreciates that any particular historical event might have happened differently, and that if it had happened differently, everything else that ensued thereafter would have been different too. But he who is the superior human is master of all contingency. The infinite realm of possibility is not comprised of random and meaningless accident at all, but of a perfect realization of art. Every historical event occurring in the domain of personal power is a perfect realization of that will to power. The point is this: the eternal recurrence is not a return to the past. It's not a reliving of past times at all. In a sense, it's the absolute opposite. It's a recognition that every eventuality of life that has been and that could have been is inherently perfect. There is no counterfactuality, not even death itself, that is not embraced by the will to power of the noble. For the superior human is master of contingency itself. And the superior romantic must rise to the challenge too. In the next episode, I'll look at another Weimar resident who rose to that challenge, Richard Strauss. But I'll finish now by playing another something of the antecedent to Nietzsche and Strauss. This is from the fifth movement of my Third Symphony, of Wagner and Schopenhauerian will. Thanks for listening.